Hello and welcome to the Our Future Cities podcast. I'm Monai Alati, and today we're diving into a topic that's reshaping urban life around the world, the 15-minute city. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize their enduring connection to the land, waters, and culture. As we explore ideas for sustainable and resilient cities, we honor their wisdom and contributions towards caring for this land. Joining me today is Dr. Crystal Legacy, a leading voice in urban planning and a highly respected academic at the University of Melbourne. As an associate professor in urban planning, Crystal's work focuses on creating sustainable, inclusive, and future-ready cities. Her research spans critical areas like transport planning, participatory city-making, and the role of governance in shaping urban spaces. She's particularly interested in how communities can play a more active role in planning processes, ensuring that urban development aligns with the needs and aspirations of the people who live there. Her insights have been published widely, and she's known for her thought leadership in the push for resilient and equitable urban environments. Crystal brings a wealth of knowledge to our conversation today about the 15-minute city and its potential to transform how we live, work, and connect with our communities. Without further ado, Crystal, welcome to the podcast. So thank you so much, Crystal, for joining us today. So before we dive into the topic, could you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and the work you do?
Yes, thanks for having me on your podcast. My name is I'm Associate Professor Crystal Legacy at the University of Melbourne. I'm in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. And my research interests are in the politics of infrastructure planning and the politics of public participation. And I like to look at how the two intersect in cities.
That's nice. So are you familiar with the concept of the 15-minute city? How would you define it in the context of Melbourne's urban planning landscape?
Oh, I sure am familiar with it. The 15-minute city as an idea has been around for several decades. We've been calling it the 15-minute city more recently, but we've been talking about land use and transport planning, where we design cities in a way that allow people to get around and have access to jobs and services and recreation within close proximity to where they live. So the 15-minute city is just an extension of that policy. And the idea is that you can gain access to jobs, services, and recreation within 15 minutes of your home. Where it gets a little bit muddled, is that by car? Is that by walking? Is that by public transport? My vision for a city is that we'd have access to all those important services within 15 minutes of walking or public transport.
Of course, with any big idea, there are challenges. What are some of the main barriers cities face when trying to adopt this model, do you think?
Oh, so many challenges. You may be aware of some of the conspiracy theories around the 15-minute city. And I think some of those conspiracy theories were born out of our experiences of lockdowns and in this idea that it's a way of government kind of controlling movement across the city. I don't subscribe to that, of course, but that can be a barrier. Another barrier is just ensuring that when we do urban planning, when we plan cities, we do so in a way that integrates land use. So like, where do we build houses? Where do schools go? Where do shopping centers go? Where do shops go? Where do we accommodate for work? And how that sits in relationship to transport. When we design a transport system, when we have a train line or train stop, a train station, what would be quote unquote best practice? And I use quotes because we can interrogate what that means. Is that we typically see higher density around train stations. Many Melburnians would be familiar with train stations out in the middle or outer suburbs where they're surrounded by car parks. That would not be best practice as I see it. A better way to accommodate or to achieve the 15-minute city is to make sure that when you get off the train station, you can walk to a shop, or you might be able to pick up your child from a daycare center, or you might be able to get your groceries collected and then onto a bus or a tram or onto a bike, a cargo bike, and then you can then finish the rest of your journey to your home.
That seems so much more convenient because so many days I have to leave my car in the train station car park because there's no parking in the city. And it's so expensive as well for
Yeah.
parking.
Yeah. And I would argue that we shouldn't have free parking in the city. We should make it expensive in the city.
Why is that?
We would want to make parking expensive in the city because we don't want cars in the city. So we want to encourage people to take public transport into the city. Now, we recognize that like Melbourne, the way it's designed has a dominant city center, CBD, and then a very dispersed urban fabric once we move beyond the CBD. What we want to do is concentrate development around train stations. So rather than you park at that train station, you might take a bus to the train station, which is a high frequency, high quality bus, in which case you can complete your entire journey without actually getting into a car.
Yeah.
That would be ideal. That would be something that we should strive for. And the 15-minute city as a policy can help us conceptualize that. Other cities around the world have achieved that kind of model where, there's lower dependency on the car, but with climate change and spatial inequality, it is expensive to drive from the outskirts of Melbourne into the CBD where there's jobs and services because you'll have to get onto a toll road. You'll have to pay money to access, to drive on that toll road. And then, of course, once you get into the city, you will have to pay money to park your car because public streets are public.
Yeah.
And you should probably, it's one of those things that we have to manage demands. We do have to charge.
And when you said that other cities around the world have implemented this, could you give us an example of a few cities that have implemented this and seen like a positive impact from this?
Yeah, look, there's different kinds of models. Like we talk about Barcelona superblocks, how in Melbourne we have Burke Street Mall and we have Swanston Street that is pedestrianized. In Spain and Barcelona, they have whole areas that are pedestrianized. So it's multiple streets, like a big block. It would be like taking the Huddle grid and turning it into. I'm Canadian and I from Toronto, and although Toronto is very much a car dependent city, it has done a little bit better at concentrating development around train stations. So to reduce people's dependency on the car to get access to the train station or the subway. Parts of Europe, you might see better quality public transport. We tend to talk a lot about German cities in planning and how they have higher frequency, higher quality trains systems throughout the region. So I think if Melbourne was able to get to a point where when you arrived at the train station, you didn't have to look at the timetable. There would always just be a train there. You never have to wait any longer than 7 minutes. That would be amazing.
Yeah, no, so much more convenient.
And cities around the world do it already. And it's that kind of level of convenience that then helps us move away from car dependency. And unfortunately, one of the barriers to the 15-minute city, to come to your original question, is the politicization. All of this is very political.
Yeah.
And we design our cities around the automobile. And to shift their thinking away from ultimate freedom is freedom of mobility through a car is a really tough conversation to win.
Apart from what you said about the trains and having them come sooner, what other transport changes do you think would be necessary to support a 15-minute city?
Bike lanes, good quality pedestrian spaces, especially in Melbourne, where in any Australian city where it gets quite hot, making sure that we have adequate shading, that we have good quality bus shelters. I know there's a campaign going on at the moment looking at poor quality bus shelters and how you might stand waiting for a bus whilst being very exposed to the weather or to the sun. Those are like really easy, low-hanging fruit things that we can do to make that experience a little bit better. But even thinking about children and school zones, making sure that school zones are pedestrian friendly and children friendly, kid friendly, to get parents out of this expectation that you just drop your kid off at school and then you drive off. That we have walking schools and walking school buses, and there's just different policies. So there's a lot of things that we can do. In fact, we know what should be done. We just don't do it. So that's my frustration as someone who teaches urban planning, because I feel like a lot of the research that around the 15-minute city is not new. We've we've known that this is a really good way to address kind of some of the social and environmental challenges we see, but the barriers are more political and institutional.
Now, moving on from the barriers, from your perspective, are some of the core benefits of the 15-minute city models for individuals and communities?
A healthy city is a walkable city. A healthy city is a city where we're not breathing in the exhaust fumes of other people's cars, right? A healthy city is a city where I can ride my bike and not fear getting doored or getting knocked down by a car, right? So public health and health generally is incredibly important to the 15-minute city policy. And of course, everyone is concerned about their health. We want to live long and we want to live really healthy lives. So the 15-minute city helps us achieve that. So that's one benefit. There are social benefits. The 15-minute city allows someone like me, so I live alone, I don't have any family. And one of the ways in which I build community is just by passing people who become familiar faces on the road or familiar faces on the footpath, right? Where I can say hello to them and they say hello to me. And I develop a sense of community, a sense of connection to the place that I'm sitting in. So there's social benefits. There are also economic benefits as well. Main streets, those really wonderful main streets or high streets where you have local shops. Sydney Road, I'm in Brunswick and I live just off of Sydney Road. And I may have an ambition to go and pick up some milk, but as I walk along the street, I might decide to pop into a little art exhibition. I might bump into a neighbor or a student. I'm always bumping into former students in Brunswick. Or I might decide to stop off and have a cup of coffee at one of the cafes. So it really lends itself to serendipitous kind of encounters that can be both social but also economic because I'm buying things and things that probably I wasn't expecting to purchase. So there can be economic benefits. Of course, there's huge environmental benefits. Like, my goodness, getting people out of their cars, huge. The embodied energy involved in a car, even if you have an electric car, there's a lot of carbon involved in that. The streets can be really unfriendly places if they're being occupied by cars. And so if we get cars off streets and make them more pedestrian focused, jaywalking is no longer illegal because people just walk on streets because they're public spaces. Streets are public spaces. That just creates a safer, more social, more convivial, it increases the opportunity for economic productivity of a different kind, and it's probably more environmentally sustainable as well.
What practical steps can cities take to start moving towards the vision?
Moving towards the 15-minute cities and implementation. Look, I think a place like Melbourne has a policy. We have the policy in place. Where we fall down is in implementation. Mm-hmm. So what I'd like to see is bold leadership from our politicians to really champion the idea of the 15-minute city, help to build a story around it. Like, what are the co-benefits? What are the health benefits, social benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits? Then also think about how to build familiarity with this idea so that people don't resist it, so people don't fear it as a kind of change that will somehow erode their quote unquote right to free parking, right? Yeah. Or right to their car, right? So it is a cultural shift, it's a behavior shift. And because it is a shift, it can be really politically difficult to achieve. So one of the things I'd like to see is the politics around this shifting. So the more we talk about it, the more we start to see examples of it, and we start to spotlight those examples. Look, we've done it over here. We could do it over here now. And we just build in a degree of bold, ambitious policy delivery. And that's something that I'd like to see Melbourne do. Melbourne has become very unfriendly as a city, especially from the perspective of someone who's not a car user. So I don't drive. It's just a choice I've made. I've been living here for nearly 20 years and I've never owned a car. And I get around fully on my feet or on public transport or on a bike. And over the course of the 20 years, I have felt increasingly more unsafe as a result of that choice.
Is that just because of
there's more
traffic?
Cars? Yeah. Oh, yeah. More cars. It's a bit more intense. People seem to be a little bit more impatient. And I understand why they're impatient, because they're frustrated, because they're sitting in traffic. But as I say to people, if you're sitting in a car and you're complaining about the traffic, recognize that you are the traffic.
Yeah. So, bringing this closer to home, how is Melbourne aligning with the 15-minute city principles? Or let's take it as Victoria. And where do you think we are seeing progress? I know like suburbs like Carlton and Fitzroy amongst the cities that align with this concept. But what about suburbs like Clyde North and Wyndham Vale?
Yeah, look, it's easy for people who live in the inner north or inner west or inner south to be living the 15-minute city dream by accident because we have a legacy of good quality public transport systems in the inner neighborhoods. We also have, there's a legacy of fairly good planning in terms of shops and access to social services and jobs. And they're all, in terms of proximity, pretty close to the CBD as well. Where it gets a little bit problematic is once we get out to the outer suburbs, where we have master planned precinct structured planning. So that's just a fancy way of talking about how do we plan master planned estates on the urban periphery. So we're really good at putting roads down, really good at getting houses in, not very good at getting social services in, schools, hospitals, jobs, and we're terrible at public transport access. So we might have a token bus stop, and if we're lucky, we might have a bus shelter attached to that bus. But how frequently does that bus come? Probably once an hour, and probably not at all on a Sunday. That's not a really good quality outcome. So what you have are these master planned estates that are very car dependent. And so the 15-minute cities is just not being achieved because we're not prioritizing the infrastructure alongside the housing.
So, looking into the future, how do you see the concept of the 15-minute city evolving? Could this model address some of the larger issues like climate change or social inequality?
Look, it's not a silver bullet solution to those really complex challenges, right? It's one of the things that the 15-minute city is at risk of delivering is gentrification.
Mhm.
So increasing the property prices. And that can result in displacing people who can't afford to live there, then they get pushed out further and further. So the question of equity is really important. What we haven't discussed yet is how to integrate social and public housing. And that's vital. And that is really challenging to do because we have a very market based system here. The developers have quite a lot of control. And we need to compel the private sector, the developers, to deliver affordable housing. But we need to also bolster and expand the remit of delivery of public housing. So that's the role government plays in subsidizing housing. And that needs to be part of the delivery around the 15-minute cities. And without that, then it's going to be really hard for us to achieve social equity, social and spatial equity. In terms of environmental, um, look, I think it's certainly a giant leap forward in terms of addressing climate change and environmental issues, in part because our reliance on at least the car hopefully is reduced. But we also have to think about the quality of the built environment and the building materials we're using. So it's not an easy answer to the environmental
Yeah.
question because there's so many components that need to be factored in. So I think it moves us in the right direction, but we need to think thoughtfully
Yeah,
about all the different components of what it means to have a 15-minute city.
of course. Do you think there's a role for technology within this?
So when we think about the smart city, we can think about it in a number of ways. One of which is to how do cities become more efficient, more effective? It also could be about data. So how might we use our smartphones to collect data about where people are moving and what spaces in the cities people are using more so than others? The smart city is a concept that was very popular for a while, and it feels like it has waned in its popularity as a policy ambition for for the time being. And I think partly because of questions of data sovereignty. So these little devices that we walk around with, they give lots of information about us and our movement, and that can go into the hands of the private sector, of different mega corporations. And there are some questions around transparency, I think, and privacy that are haven't been fully resolved and the governance of that data. So I think the smart city I can look to my colleagues for their comment on that. It's not an area that I know a whole lot about. But yes, technology plays a role, but it's not
Not
the
the main
silver.
thing, yeah.
No, yeah.
Just wrapping things up, for listeners interested in supporting this concept, what role can they play in advocating for the 15-minute city model?
Ah, yes. Just talk to your local MP, talk to your local councillor about the 15-minute city. Ask questions, be curious. It all comes down to it all comes down to politics in many ways, big P and small p politics, and what the priorities are of our elected officials. And if they're talking about the 15-minute city, that's really great because that means that it's part of their mandate and hopefully they will prioritize it. But also talk to your neighbors about it, right? Because the 15-minute city is it's just a buzz concept, right?
Yeah.
It's very popular at the moment. But maybe talk about things like how could you get to work differently where you feel a little less stressed because you're not stuck in traffic for 20 minutes or an hour? Or how can we better create a sense of community in our neighborhood? What would that look like? Do we need more public spaces and parks? And we haven't even talked about public space in this discussion, and that's really important. Public space and open space for play and recreation, and just to be able to open your lungs.
Yeah.
I live in Brunswick, as I've said. It feels a little bit like a concrete jungle at times, but I live very close to the Mary Creek. I'm very lucky, and I go for a run along there on the weekends, and I just it's just so nice. And you have that connection to nature, which is really important. So I think one of the final points to make is people tend to think about the 15-minute city as a trade-off to having access to green space, having a backyard, for instance. And I would just really challenge that binary between have one, then you trade off the other. I think 15-minute city also needs to include access to good quality public and open green spaces. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us, Crystal. It's inspiring to hear about the possibilities for a 15-minute city model and how we can all contribute. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope this episode has given you a fresh perspective on urban planning and the power of community. Until next time, take care and keep thinking about how we can build a more connected city together.
Thank you for the opportunity.